The arrow hit Caden Voss in the chest before he even saw who fired it. He had been crouching behind a collapsed building in what used to be the financial district of New Denver, a city that hadn't existed 30 years ago, built on the ruins of the old one after the fracture. The fracture was what people called it now, the day the sky cracked open like an egg and something came through. Not an invasion. Not exactly. More like a migration that went horribly wrong. A desperate species arriving in the wrong place at the wrong time, colliding with a civilization that responded to the unknown with weapons first and questions never. Caden was 28 years old, a former combat medic turned freelance security contractor, which was a polite way of saying he got paid to keep dangerous people alive in dangerous places. He was not a hero. He had never wanted to be. He paid his rent on time, called his mother every Sunday, and kept a small collection of succulents on his windowsill because they were the only living things that could survive his irregular schedule. He had no business being in the middle of a firefight between government extraction teams and what the news called alien sympathizers, civilians who had been hiding refugees from the other side of the fracture. But the child had been crying. He'd heard her from 3 blocks away, a sound that didn't quite match human acoustics. Too many harmonics layered into a single sob, like a chord played on an instrument no one had built yet. He'd followed the sound the way you follow a scent without meaning to, pulled by something deeper than logic. He found her in a collapsed parking structure, huddled behind a concrete pillar, small enough to fit in a shopping cart. She looked approximately 7 years old by human standards, though he would later learn that was wildly inaccurate. Her skin was a pale silver blue, like moonlight on still water, and her eyes were enormous. Not unsettlingly so, but beautifully, like 2 pieces of dark amber lit from inside. She had no hair, but trailing from the back of her head were fine, filament-like strands that moved slightly even in still air, catching light like fiber optic cables. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Hey," he said, because he was not a man who led with poetry. "Are you hurt?" She blinked. Once. Twice. Then she said, in a voice like wind chimes caught in a thunderstorm, "They are coming." He didn't ask who. He could hear the boots on concrete. He pulled her behind a larger pillar, pressing his body in front of hers, and that was when the extraction team rounded the corner. 4 soldiers in matte black armor, carrying weapons that were not standard military issue. Private contractors, then, the kind who didn't file reports. "Step away from the asset," the lead soldier said. Caden had been in enough situations to know that asset meant the child would not be going somewhere safe. "She's a kid," he said. "Step away." He didn't step away. The first soldier raised a sidearm and fired. Caden felt the impact before he registered the sound, a dense, wet thud against the upper left of his chest. He had been shot before, twice, and it had felt like being hit with a hammer wrapped in fire. This felt different. This felt like being filled with something, like the projectile had dissolved into his bloodstream instead of lodging in his tissue. He stayed standing, mostly from stubbornness. The child made a sound behind him that was not a scream, but something more ancient than screaming. She pressed one small hand against the back of his jacket, and he felt, for one impossible moment, warmth spreading from that point of contact through his entire body, as if someone had poured sunlight directly into his spine. Then the building's damaged foundation, already compromised by the earlier fighting, chose that moment to give way. The ceiling came down. He woke up in darkness. Not the darkness of a room with curtains drawn or a power outage. A deeper darkness. A darkness that had texture and temperature, that pressed against his skin like velvet underwater. "You are stable," said a voice. He tried to move. Discovered he could not because he was restrained, but because his body seemed to have simply forgotten how movement worked. Like trying to remember the lyrics to a song you'd known since childhood and finding only the melody, no words. "Who's there?" he said. Or tried to say. He wasn't entirely sure sound came out. "My designation in your language would take approximately 40 seconds to pronounce correctly," the voice said. "The child calls me Ren. You may also." The child. He found he could turn his head, slightly. There was a faint luminescence in the darkness, something like bioluminescence, pulsing slow and regular as a heartbeat. "Is she? She is safe. Because of you." He processed this. "How long have I been out?" A pause. The kind of pause that means the answer is not a comfortable one. "Ren," he said. "How long?" "Time is not." Another pause. Your measurement of time does not translate cleanly to where you currently exist. But if I were to anchor your question to the world you came from, how long? 11 days, Ren said. In your experience. 31 years in the world you left. Silence. Caden lay in the luminescent dark and breathed, carefully, like a man who has been told there is a bomb nearby and has not yet been told where. That's not possible, he said. The arrows your extraction team used were not conventional weapons. They were designed to interact with alien biology, to neutralize it. You are not alien. The compound had a different reaction in your system. Your cellular biology entered a kind of, Ren seemed to search for a word. Suspension. You have been preserved. Your body has been healing itself, very slowly, in a state that reads as neither life nor death by any instrument we have. 31 years, Caden said again. Yes. My mother. I am sorry. He stared at the luminescence above him for a very long time. The child, he finally said. Where is she? She is waiting, Ren said, with something in the voice that Caden couldn't identify yet. She has been waiting for a long time. They let him recover for 3 more days before she came to see him. By then he had pieced together some context. He was on a vessel, not a ship in the nautical sense, not a spacecraft in the science fiction sense, but something in between, something that existed partially in ordinary space and partially somewhere else, like a house built on a border between 2 countries. The beings who occupied it were from the same place as the child. They treated him with extraordinary care, which might have been gratitude, or might have been something else. He had been moved to a room that was clearly designed with human comfort in mind, a bed with actual cotton sheets, a window that showed a projected landscape of green hills and morning light, a small table with what appeared to be a coffee maker. The coffee it produced was not quite right, slightly too sweet with an aftertaste of something floral, but he drank it anyway because it was a familiar shape to hold on to. He was sitting at that table, on the morning of the 3rd day, when the door opened. She walked in, and he almost didn't recognize her. 7 years old had become, not 38, not the straightforward human arithmetic of age plus time. She looked perhaps 25 by human standards, though he was already learning to distrust that kind of translation. She was tall, taller than he'd expected from the child she'd been, silver blue skin, now carrying a subtle luminescence of its own. The filament strands that had trailed from the back of her head had multiplied and lengthened, some braided with what appeared to be actual thread of light, and they moved with her movement like a living crown. She was wearing something that was probably not called a uniform by her people, but functioned like one, structured, formal, in deep blues and blacks with markings along the collar and cuffs that he somehow understood meant rank. High rank. She stopped in the doorway. He stood up. They looked at each other across the small room, and across 31 years, and across the incalculable distance between species, and the expression on her face was something he had no name for. Joy and grief and relief all tangled together into something that had been waiting so long it had grown roots. Caden Voss, she said, and his name in her mouth sounded like it meant something important, like she'd been keeping it safe. Hey, he said, because he was still not a man who led with poetry. You got tall. Her expression cracked open into something that was undeniably a laugh, even across species, even across all that time. She crossed the room in 3 steps, and she pressed her forehead against his shoulder. A gesture he would later learn was the highest form of greeting her people had, reserved for those to whom life debt was owed, for those who were considered sacred to your continued existence. And she said, quietly, into the fabric of his borrowed shirt, I looked for ways to wake you for 30 years. You found one, he said. My mother found one. Before she died, she left the research for me. A pause. She wanted to meet you. He put a careful hand on her shoulder, the way you would with someone who might need the contact or might need the space, leaving the choice to her. She pressed closer, briefly, and then stepped back and looked up at him with those enormous amber eyes, and there was something in her face now that he was still learning to read. Something like authority, like someone who had grown up carrying weight and learned to wear it straight. What are you now, he asked. Ren mentioned waiting. The way he said it was. Ren is a she, the young woman said. And she was being tactful. What are you, he asked again. She straightened slightly. The filament strands around her head caught the morning light from the projected window and scattered it into something like a halo. My people have been at war with your people for 31 years, she said. The fracture was not an invasion. It was a disaster. We were running from something much worse, something that hunts between dimensions, and we broke through into your space by accident. We have been trying to explain this ever since. We have not been well heard. I know, Caden said. I knew. Before. 3 months ago, the hunting faction from our dimension of origin broke through as well. They are here now. In your space. She met his eyes. Your government and my people must cooperate to survive what comes next. There are negotiations. They have been difficult. Your leaders do not trust my people. My people do not trust your leaders. And she stopped. Took a careful breath. 11 months ago, my people elevated me to Empress. The first since the Great Separation. It was not a title I sought. Caden absorbed this. Empress, he said. It is awkward, she said. I am aware. Does it come with the crown situation? He gestured vaguely at his own head. She touched the braided filaments self-consciously, and it was such a human gesture. So exactly what a 25-year-old might do when someone pointed out their hair, that he felt the 31 years collapse into nothing for just a moment. The formal ones are more elaborate, she said. I left that one in my quarters. I didn't want to, she stopped. I didn't want the first time you saw me to be as an empress. What did you want it to be? She looked at him steadily. As the child you kept alive. Her name, she told him, was Saraveth Aldorn Khalees, the Aldorn being a lineage marker, the Khalees being something like a soul name, given at birth and rarely spoken aloud to anyone outside the innermost circle of trust. She told him the Khalees first, before the rest, and explained afterward that this was the order in which her people shared names with those they intended to trust completely. He told her his full name was Caden Marcus Voss, which was much less impressive, and that his middle name was his grandfather's name. Marcus, she said, testing it. Was he good? He taught me to change a car tire, and told me once that courage is mostly just not stopping when you're scared. I think he was good. My grandmother told me that the longest distance any being can travel is the distance from what they fear to what they love. She paused. I thought of that often, while you were asleep. He spent the rest of that first day simply sitting with her, learning the shape of who she had become. Rin brought food, real food, which Caden suspected was an accommodation and not a standard offering. And they ate at the small table while Saraveth told him, in pieces, about the 31 years he had missed. The war, which was not quite a war, more sustained failure to communicate, punctuated by violence on both sides, driven by fear on both sides. Her childhood spent moving between safe houses, raised by a series of protectors after her parents were killed in a government raid when she was 11. The discovery of her lineage at 17, which she had not taken well. The decade of education and diplomacy, and the slow, grinding work of trying to build a bridge between two civilizations that had never wanted to meet. The research her mother had left behind, found in an encrypted archive, detailing the compound from the poisoned arrows, its interaction with human biology, the theoretical possibility of reversal if one could synthesize a counteragent in sufficient quantities in a specific environment. It took 3 years to synthesize, Saraveth said. We did not have the resources until recently. Becoming Empress has. She made a gesture he was learning to read as practical distaste. Certain advantages. You became Empress, and the first thing you did with the power was wake me up? She looked at him calmly. It was the first thing on my list. He looked at her for a moment. Saraveth, he said. Yes. I was a 28-year-old contract security guard. I crouched in front of you because you were a child who was scared. I don't need. He gestured at the ship around them, at the implicit weight of 30 years of devotion. I don't need all of this. You don't owe me anything. I know, she said. This is not payment. Then what is it? When I was 7 years old, she said carefully, as if she had thought about how to say this many times and was still not sure she had it right. I pressed my hand against the back of a human man who was standing between me and death. My people have a practice. It has no clean translation, but your language comes closest with the word witnessing. When you touch someone in a moment of crisis, you witness their soul. You see who they are under all the constructed layers. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. I witnessed you, Caden. I have known, since I was 7 years old, exactly who you are. You were 7, he said. You can't have understood. I understood more than you might think. A small smile. And I had 30 years to think about what I understood. He was quiet for a while. Outside the projected window, The fake hills were turning amber in fake late afternoon light. He'd lost 31 years. His mother was gone. The new Denver he'd known was probably unrecognizable. He was on a ship that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, across the table from an alien Empress who had looked for ways to wake him up for 30 years because when she was 7 he had stood in front of a bullet. What happens now, he asked. There are negotiations, she said, between your government and mine. They are not going well. I was hoping, she paused. I was hoping you might help. I'm a contract security guard. Medic background. I don't have diplomatic experience. You have something better, she said. You are a human who I trust, and there are very few of those. You have context that I lack. And she seemed to be working up to something. You stood in front of a weapon for someone who was not your species, for no reason other than that she was a frightened child. That is not a story my people have heard before. About humans. She met his eyes. It matters. Stories matter in negotiations. You want to use my story as a diplomatic tool. I want you to be there, she said, with an edge of something fiercer. I have sat in rooms with your government for 3 years and been told that my people are invaders, colonizers, threats. I have been met with language designed to reduce me to an enemy. I want someone in the room who knows that when I was 7 years old, a man chose me over his own safety, and I want them to know that I chose him back, that I spent 30 years looking for a way to give him back his life. Not because I owe him, but because, she stopped. Because, Caden said. Because that is who I decided to be, she said. I decided, at 7 years old, watching you stand in front of that weapon, that I would be someone worth standing in front of. The silence after that was not uncomfortable. Caden picked up his not-quite-right coffee and drank the last of it. Okay, he said. She blinked. Okay, I'll come to your negotiations. But I want real coffee. This stuff is. He tilted the mug in her direction. Close but not quite. She stared at him for a moment. Then she laughed, and it sounded like wind chimes in a thunderstorm. And he remembered standing in a ruined parking structure listening to a sound that pulled him forward without his permission, and he understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with logic, that some things begin with an ending. The first negotiation session was held on neutral ground, a repurposed oil platform in the North Sea that belonged to no government and had been decommissioned just long enough to be retrofitted as a meeting point. 17 humans representing an international coalition and 9 of Sareveth's people, including 2 of her senior advisors and Ren, who turned out to be a compact, precise being with lavender skin and the focused expression of someone perpetually doing math in their head. Caden walked in as part of Sareveth's delegation. He was the only human on her side of the table. The lead human negotiator, a severe woman named Ambassador Dalgard, looked at him with an expression that suggested she had been thoroughly briefed and was thoroughly unimpressed. Mr. Voss, she said, you've been out of contact for 31 years. Approximately, he said. Your perspective on current events is limited, he agreed. But I was there at the beginning. At the fracture. I remember what it looked like before we decided to call it an invasion. It was a migration gone wrong, he said, because he'd been listening to Sareveth for 3 days and had absorbed the shape of the argument. A species running from something that hunts between dimensions, breaking through into our space by accident. They've been trying to explain this. We've been trying to shoot it. A long silence at the table. Ambassador Dalgard looked at Sareveth. Your Majesty, is this man speaking for your delegation? Sareveth's expression was composed and impenetrable in the way Caden was learning meant she was being carefully diplomatic. Mr. Voss speaks from personal experience, she said, which is distinct from speaking for my delegation. I would suggest his perspective has value regardless of that distinction. Dalgard looked back at Caden. You were in a coma for 31 years. Yes. Due to an injury sustained while I was standing in front of a child, Caden said. In a parking garage. Because 4 private contractors were pointing weapons at her and calling her an asset. She was 7. She was scared. That was the beginning of my 31 years, Ambassador. I'd like to hear about how yours started. The silence this time was a different kind. Not hostile. Thoughtful. Across the table, one of the younger human negotiators, a man who looked like he'd been a graduate student recently, was staring at Caden with an expression Caden recognized as the recalibration face. The face you made when a story you'd been told one way turned out to have a different shape. Sareveth did not look at Caden, but the filament strands around her head shifted, catching light, and he'd been watching her long enough now to know that this was what she did when she was trying not to smile. The negotiations lasted for weeks. They were not easy. There were sessions that ended in raised voices and delegations walking out. Days when Caden sat in his assigned quarters on the platform and stared at the gray North Sea through a salt-speckled window and tried to hold on to the logic of what he was doing. He was 31 years out of date. He had missed everything. His city had changed beyond recognition. His mother was buried in a cemetery he hadn't visited yet. The world had moved on, and he was a gap-toothed space in it, a missing piece from a puzzle that had been completed without him. But Saraveth would knock on his door in the evenings, and they would sit in the common room, and she would catch him up, patiently, on the shape of the world he'd missed, not the history, but the texture of it, the way things felt from inside the years he hadn't lived. She told him about the underground networks that had formed to shelter her people. She told him about the human scientists who had collaborated with alien researchers in secret for 2 decades, and the hybrid technologies that had emerged from it, and how those technologies had quietly saved millions of human lives, and no one had been allowed to say where they came from. She told him about the songs her people had written about the fracture, the grief in them, the longing for a home they'd been forced to leave, the terror of the thing that had chased them here. He told her about his succulents, which had probably died, and about his grandfather who had taught him to change tires, and about courage mostly being not stopping when you're scared. "He sounds like someone from our oral histories," she said once. "The ordinary wise one. He was a retired postal worker who liked fishing. The most wisdom I have encountered in my life," she said seriously, "has come from people who were, by external measures, entirely ordinary." On the 3rd week, Caden did something that was not part of any official plan. He asked, through Wren, to address the full joint assembly, both delegations, in formal session, no record. Saraveth gave him a long look when he told her. "What are you going to say?" she asked. "I'm going to tell them what I saw," he said. "At the beginning, when it was just a sound I followed because it sounded like a kid who was lost." She was quiet for a moment. "That is not a diplomatic maneuver," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is." She seemed to search for words. "It is vulnerable." "Yeah. That makes it," she stopped. "More or less effective?" "I was going to say," she said carefully, "that it makes it true. In the way that matters." He shrugged. "I was a mediocre negotiator in the old world. I'm probably a terrible one now. But I'm good at telling true things. It's basically all I've got." She looked at him with those amber eyes, and there was something in her expression that he had no name for yet, though he was starting to suspect he would, given time. "It is not nothing," she said. "Being good at telling true things." He stood at the head of the table in the informal assembly room, 26 people watching him, human and not human, diplomats and advisors, and a young empress who was sitting very straight with her hands folded and her face composed, and her filament crown catching the fluorescent light of a repurposed oil platform meeting room. He didn't have notes. He told them about the sound he'd heard from 3 blocks away, the way it had pulled him forward without permission. The girl behind the pillar, silver blue and enormous-eyed, who had looked at him and said they are coming with the matter-of-fact exhaustion of someone who had been running for a long time. He told them about standing in front of the weapon without thinking it through, which he wanted to be clear was not heroism, was not a plan, was just the thing his body did before his brain caught up, because she was small and scared, and he was larger and less scared, and the math seemed obvious. He told them about 31 years in a dark that felt like velvet, and waking up to find that everything had continued without him, and the strange doubled grief of that, the grief for what he'd lost, and the stranger grief of knowing the world had kept moving and proved that it could. He told them about 3 days at a table with an alien empress who had pressed her forehead against his shoulder and said she had been looking for a way to wake him up for 30 years. Not because she owed him, because she had decided, at 7 years old, that she was going to be someone worth being stood in front of, and 31 years later she had become that person, and she had come back to tell him. "I don't know what you've been told about these people," he said, addressing the human delegation, but not only the human delegation. "I know what I've been told in the past 3 weeks. I know the shape of 31 years that I missed, from the inside, from someone who lived them." He paused. "I know that the thing that hunted them to our door is here now, and it doesn't care about any of our categories. It doesn't care that we've spent 3 decades pointing weapons at each other over a misunderstanding. It's coming, And the only question worth asking is what we want to be when it arrives. He looked at Saraveth. She was looking back at him. The filament strands were still. When I was 28 years old, he said, I stood in front of a weapon for a child who wasn't my species, and I didn't think twice. I'd like to suggest that we all have that same basic ability, and we've been spending 30 years not using it, and maybe now would be a good time to start. He sat down. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Ambassador Dalgard uncapped her pen and set it to the paper in front of her and said, to no one in particular, all right, let's start with the defense protocols. The treaty took 6 more months to finalize. Caden was not present for most of it. He was, as he had pointed out, 31 years behind on everything. And there was a long period of quiet reconstruction, of learning what the world had become, of visiting his mother's grave and sitting with the particular silence of too late, and letting that be what it was. He visited New Denver. It was unrecognizable and entirely itself, the way cities always are, the bones the same. Everything else changed, the streets narrower than his memory, the skyline different, new buildings grown over old scars. He got an apartment with a window that faced east. He bought new succulents. He called Saraveth every few days. She was conducting the final treaty sessions from her vessel, then from a formal meeting site in Geneva, then from a series of human cities she visited as part of the ratification process, the first official state visits of their kind. He watched the news footage with the slightly surreal feeling of watching someone he knew become history in real time. The tall silver-blue woman in formal dress, with her filament crown elaborate and formal, moving through rooms of dignitaries with the precise, unhurried authority of someone who had spent 30 years becoming exactly this. She still knocked on his door when she was nearby. She still drank the not-quite-right coffee with him and told him things from the inside of her years that didn't make the news. You are adjusting? She asked him, one evening in early autumn, sitting on his second-hand couch in his apartment with the east-facing window. Slowly, he said, It's strange. Grief is strange. You think you should be done with it by now, and then it comes back in the middle of buying groceries. We have a word for that, she said. The grief that is done and then not done. That returns in ordinary moments. The best translation I have is, she thought, something like the echo that proves the original sound was real. He looked at her. I like that, he said. She had taken off the formal crown for the evening, and the natural filaments moved softly in the draft from the window, and she looked less like the footage of her and more like the person he was learning. The person who had been a child running from something terrible, who had grown up to become a bridge between two species that had been trying to destroy each other, who had spent 30 years carrying his name in her memory like something important. I owe you an apology, she said. He frowned. For what? For the weight of my gratitude. I have thought about this. She was precise, deliberate. I spent 30 years being grateful to you, and I am aware that this creates a kind of pressure, an expectation. You did not ask for the devotion of someone who became an empress. You stood in front of a weapon for a frightened child. These are different things. Saraveth, I want to be clear, she continued, that I do not expect the gratitude to be returned. I do not expect anything from you on the basis of what I feel. You are 31 years displaced, you are grieving, you are rebuilding. I do not want to be another obligation. He looked at her for a moment. Can I tell you what I actually think? He said. She nodded. I think, he said, that I have been in this apartment for 4 months, and the only times it has felt like a place I live rather than a place I'm staying have been when you were in it. He held her gaze. I think you spent 30 years becoming someone worth standing in front of, and you did it. You actually did it. I don't know how many people set that as their goal at 7 years old and make it true, but you did. He paused. I think I missed 31 years of things. I'm not going to also miss the thing that's right in front of me. The filament strands caught the last of the evening light. I am the Empress of my people, she said. This is a logistically complicated circumstance. I'm a 31 years out-of-date former medic with an apartment full of succulents, he said. I'm not going to pretend I have this figured out. Something in her face moved. But you are not. You are not refusing the complication. I stood in front of a poisoned arrow for you when I didn't even know your name, he said. I think I can handle a logistically complicated circumstance. She looked at him for a long, careful moment. Then, with the precision of someone performing an action they have thought about and chosen deliberately, she crossed the distance between them on the couch and pressed her forehead against his shoulder. The same gesture as before. The highest form of greeting. The one for those to whom life debt was owed. But also, he was learning, the one for those who were being welcomed home. The treaty was signed in January, in a ceremony that was transmitted to every screen on Earth and to the fleet of ships that had been cautiously approaching from the edge of the solar system. Saraveth signed her name, all 42 characters of it, in a script that looked like music written sideways, and Ambassador Dalgard signed her name, and someone cried on both sides of the table, and the footage would be played for generations on 2 worlds, in 2 languages, under 2 very different kinds of stars. Caden watched from the 4th row of the human delegation's seating, which was the most prominent position he had been willing to accept despite several attempts to put him closer. He was not a diplomat. He was not a historical figure, regardless of what some people seemed to think. He was a man who had stood in front of a weapon for a frightened child and gone to sleep for 31 years and woken up in a different world that turned out to be better than the one he'd left, in the ways that mattered. When Saraveth turned from the signing table, she found him in the crowd immediately, those amber eyes, undiminished by any distance, and the expression on her face was the one he had no diplomatic name for. The one that was not Empress and not the child in the parking garage, but something that had grown in the years between and become its own thing, enormous and quiet and certain. She gave the official address first, in both languages, which took 40 minutes and covered the treaty frameworks and the defensive alliance against the hunting faction and the establishment of joint research programs and cultural exchange protocols that would take decades to fully implement. Then she stepped down from the podium. She walked across the ceremony floor, past 17 diplomats and 4 camera operators and 1 bewildered junior attaché who had to step quickly to the side. She stopped in front of the 4th row. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder. Every camera in the room captured it. It would appear on the front page of every newspaper in 16 languages. Scholars would write about it. It would become the image that, more than any document, represented the moment that 2 civilizations chose to stop being afraid of each other. But Caden didn't know that yet. In that moment, he just had his hand on her shoulder, leaving the choice, as always, to her, and he could feel her exhale against his jacket, a long breath let out after a very long time of holding. "Hey," he said quietly, into the filament crown. "You did it." "We," she said. "We did it." Outside the convention center, the January sky was gray and enormous, and somewhere beyond it, past the cold curve of the atmosphere, past the place where the sky cracked open 31 years ago and let something frightened through, the stars continued their ancient, indifferent burning. They remembered everything. They were very patient.